community space because it's the only one we've got, and it's been really beautifully improved lately, so it's really a nice space to be in. But yeah, raise your hand if you need anything. There's toilets just outside that door, the first green door, so you have to go outside and the first green door if you need them. So this series, this Hardwick History lecture series, it's 3 lectures in a row, and going from ancient history to modern to today, really. And one of the ideas of this was to sort of bring people who live on Hardwick up to date with the history of the estate, the modern history of the estate as well, people who, you know, haven't lived in the area long and don't know some of the kind of more modern history. But it made sense to tell the whole story. So we're starting with ancient history today. And you people may or may not know that we're blessed to have 4 really archaeologists, including Nikki, on the estate. So there's been a lot of kind of investment and interest in Hardwick's archaeology and ancient history already. And then we've brought in a real expert, Wendy Morrison from the Chilterns Conservation Board, who's done this amazing LiDAR project, Beacons of the Past project, which she'll talk about more. So this talks about ancient history, and there'll be space at the end for other people who have some knowledge about ancient history locally to also chip in and ask questions. Then we've got the amazing Danny, who has been is a detectorist in Tolly's Fields here up on Noah Night by the veg shed, and he's brought all his finds from the estate to kind of bring the history to life. And then the next talk, which is in April the 11th, 21st, I can't remember anyway, put it on the door, is about the modern history. So it's about Hardwick House, the people who kind of made it an estate from the kind of Normans up to Charles Rose, Victorian period. And then the next talk, and that's with Michael Redley, who authored a booklet on the real Mr. Toad, Charles Day Rose. And then the next one is about the recent history of Hardwick, so really about Sir Julian Rose, my dad's kind of time on the estate, and the changes that went with that. So the agricultural activism, the raw milk campaign, going organic. It's about that recent history, and then a bit about today, and then what's kind of coming. So it's kind of telling the whole story of this place. So that's just to give you an outline. Hope to see you at the other talks as well. And so we'll kick off then by Wendy's going to give a nice presentation about Hardwick's ancient history and how it fits into kind of the local area. So I'll hand over to Wendy.
Hello. Thanks for coming out and filling the space. Can everyone see this? Because it's going to be quite important to be able to see some of the things. So I wonder if we dimmed some lights, if it would.
Can you go any higher? Does the screen go up?
I don't think it goes any higher, to be honest. Put it on something. But it's a lot brighter now. I'll be back. No? 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 Okay.
Do you want to, because it can go down to nothing if you like.
I think that's, yeah. Then that way when people fall asleep I won't see them.
Are you ready?
Yeah. Yay. Right. Everyone stay awake. Right. Hi. I'm Wendy Morrison, and I am the Heritage and Archaeology Manager for the Chilterns Conservation Board. But prior to that, I've only been in that post for a few months, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end. But prior to that, for the last 5 years, I've been running Beacons of the Past, which is a lottery-funded project looking at the entire Chilterns AONB, and looking specifically at the hill forts. Now, how many people here, and yes, I can see your hands, how many people here know you have a hill fort very nearby? That is so great. That's actually the best answer. Because every time I give this talk, I go up and down the Chilterns, and there's 20 of them across the Chilterns. And so every time I ask an audience, where's your nearest hill fort? Maybe 1 or 2 people will put a hand up and they know, but most people don't know. Even those like in High Wycombe, where there are 2 right there in the middle of High Wycombe, and people are like, I don't know. So I'm very proud of you all. You win the prize. The prize being, this is the shortest version of this talk that I've So what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to end with a focus on Hardwick, but is largely going to be talking about what this project did, what LiDAR is, what LiDAR can show you, and then we're going to look at what the LiDAR of the Hardwick estate and environs looks like. And you're going to be the very first people to clap eyes on an artistic reconstruction of your local hill fort. So, that's the right response. That's right.
Just can everyone see it? Because we could try and raise it up if needed.
Yes. Yeah. Let's do that.
Think of a way.
Yeah. Let's hold up. Stick some of these. So if I get, if we do that a little bit.
Are they going to balance?
See better now.
What do we reckon?
Like Japan.
Is that a bit better? Like a little engineering.
I feel guilty.
Okay. Right, where was I? Yes. So, obviously, you know where the Chilterns AONB is. It's all the green bits, covers 4 different counties, and is over 800 square kilometres of loveliness, chalk escarpment. I work for the Conservation Board, as I say, which looks after the AONB, and
Will it focus a bit better?
it won't.
We can move it just
We have
a
to-
little bit. Yeah?
Now it's worse.
That's better, isn't it? Yeah.
There isn't too much text, so don't worry about it. But this was a National Lottery funded project, nearly £1 million that was successfully lobbied for by the Conservation Board in 2017. And then in 2018, after I finished yet another postdoc at Oxford and was looking for work and was sort of slumming it, working in commercial archaeology, Nick knows what I'm talking about, I was parachuted in to deliver this amazing project. And as an Iron Age archaeologist, this was the dream come true, to sort of work with hill forts and to do a LiDAR survey. So the project was designed around this idea of beacons, right? These 3 beacons. I think it's because the people that envisioned this project, and it had a very long gestation period, it started about 2009, people started gathering together ideas for this hill forts project. They thought it was like the scarp slope of the Chilterns would be like all those hill forts dotted across it, and if you lit a fire in each one, it would be like lighting the beacons for Gondor, and you would see the beacon chain go up the escarpment from Ivinghoe Beacon, Pulpit Hill, all the hill forts on fire. No evidence for this ever happening in the past, ever, but it's a lovely conceit to think that we're illuminating the past, lighting these hill forts on fire. Don't light your local hill fort on fire. The 3 beacons were discovery, learning, and protection. So discovery was to learn more about these 20 hill forts, and the jewel in the crown of that is LiDAR, which is principally what I'll be talking about tonight. But we did other bits and pieces. Also learning, so we were not only disseminating what we learned from the discovery phase, but also teaching skills and going into schools, and there was a whole variety, a whole suite of things that we delivered, and I'm happy to take questions at the end about the other aspects of the project, but I'm not going to talk to you all night about, classroom stuff and augmented reality and interpretation boards, but they're great. And then beacons of protection, this was talking to landowners and land managers about how best to look after ancient earthworks, because it's not intuitive how best to manage them. And we also did a little bit to try to cut down on some heritage crime, which it's apparently an unwritten rule that if you have a bank and a ditch, you must put sofas and mattresses in it. It's a thing. So we tried to do a lot of work about that. Oh, also it's great for mountain biking, which is what the ancients wanted us to do. So that's sort of the premise of the project. And here you can see all these little dots. These are all the hill forts of the Chilterns. And the keen-eyed amongst you will realise that whilst you have nice little clusters here, there's literally nothing on that side. And one of the things we wanted to find out in the project was that a factor of just not finding them? Were they there under the tree cover? Would the LiDAR reveal dozens of hill forts that had never been seen before? And spoiler alert, no. There really are no hill forts on that scarp slope, so that is a real blank, which sometimes in archaeology can be just as interesting as presence of stuff. You'll also notice that they seem to pair up across the Chilterns. They form nice little clusters, so Medmenham and Danesfield Camp are minutes away from each other. And of course you've got Castle Grove Camp over near Kidmore End. Anyone been to Kidmore End recently? You seen the beautiful interpretation panel?
Yes.
That's mine. So you've got this cluster here with Bosedown and Castle Grove Camp. So the idea was to learn a bit more about them in the context of their ancient landscape. Now, I'm just going to segue a little bit as to what is a hill fort, although I'm so proud of everybody out there, they already know where it is and all that sort of thing. Who knows exactly what a hill fort was used for?
Nobody.
I love you guys. This is exactly the right answer. So there are a variety of purposes. Now you see I've rather cheekily stolen one from Dorset. That's not one of our Chiltern hill forts, but it is a corker, largest one in Europe. here in the Chilterns, our hill forts are constructed sometime between the end of the late Bronze Age right the way through to the sort of latest Middle Iron Age, which is sort of unhelpful waffle talk from an archaeologist. If we had to put dates on it, probably about 1050 BC. That's the earliest date for Ivinghoe Beacon, which we're dating to a sword that we found there. Right the way up to about 200 BC, probably Cholesbury Camp up by Tring, which is one of our most recent ones, if you like. This is a reconstruction of Kidmore End. If you've seen the sign, you've seen that before. But largely they're just ditches dug into the ground. You take the arisings and you make earthworks out of them. Now, they're not always on hills. So there are over 4,000 hill forts in the new Hill Fort Atlas that was published this year, or end of last year. 4,000 hill forts in the UK and Ireland. Not all of them are on hills, but we call them hill forts. And most of them show no evidence of having been used as a fort. No violence, no fortification, that sort of thing. So why do we get this word hill fort? Where does that come from? It's largely because the earlier antiquarians and the first archaeologists were military men who saw these things and thought it's precisely the sort of thing that I would have dug up in, Afghanistan or other bits of the pink map where they were doing things. And so they assumed that these were military in origin. And in fact, they were so wrong about some aspects that they thought they were built by Caesar against the Britons, by the Britons against Caesar, which is why a lot of our hill forts are called Caesar's Camp or, Caesar's whatever. And then they took another leap, and they were constructed by the Saxons against the Danes, or possibly the Danes against the Saxons. So Danesbury, Danesfield, Camp, Danbury, all these names for these places. They could not be further from the truth. They're off by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. But we're stuck with this hill fort name because they thought they were all fortifications. We could get rid of hill fort and call them prehistoric earthwork enclosures in significant locations. But it's a mouthful, so we do what archaeologists always do, which is say, this term we now know is wrong, but we rather like it, so we're going to bore you to tears with why it's wrong and then continue to use it. Get me started on the term Celts sometime. So we know that they are not always on hills, they're not always in fortifications. They do take up places of significance in the landscape, and that's really the key point. They're built over a huge time span. Some may have been defensive. We can't argue that Maiden Castle wasn't used defensively. But most of our sites here in the Chilterns, for instance, show no evidence that they were used defensively. Some might have had settlement inside, lots of roundhouses. Some show no evidence of that. They could have been used for stock control, marketplaces, fairs, seasonal gathering, and the archaeologists get out of jail free card, ritual. But no matter what they were used for, they are definitely evidence of the control of resources, whether that's human resources, like getting everybody out there to dig all those ditches, or communal resources, everybody coming together to want to build these things. Now, if I were standing here in the 1960s, I wouldn't be here. But if I was standing here in that time, I would tell you that we believed in a big man, a big chief, who had a big roundhouse in the hill fort, and he made everybody dig the hill fort, and it was his status and power. We don't really believe that anymore. Even Barry Cunliffe, who came up with the big man idea for Danebury, doesn't really believe that anymore. Because there's no evidence for that kind of hierarchical society at that chunk of time when the hill forts are being built. We want to talk to the end of the Iron Age, we start phasing into contact with Rome and the petty kings and all that sort of thing. Fine. But in this period, we're not looking at that kind of structure. So if we don't have a big guy with a stick saying, get out there and build that hill fort for me, what are we looking at? We are looking at probably communities coming together and putting a lot of effort into constructing this place for any and all of those reasons. Now, some of our hill forts in the Chilterns are huge. Bowestown Camp is really big. Some of them are tiny, like Pulpit Hill. If anyone's ever been up to Pulpit Hill near Chequers, it's less than a hectare. It's really, really bijou. Very small hill fort. Why the differences? Well, at this point, I'm going to segue to talk about time. Now, I struggle with time, as Miriam will tell you. I thought it was 7 o'clock I was meant to be here, and I was terribly early. I struggle with time in the sense of post-pandemic. I will talk to someone and say, oh yes, last spring oh no, that was 2020. Everything seems to have gone into this void. So how do you wrap your brain around 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 12,000 years? Human history. How do we wrap our brains around these big chunks of time? Well, astronomers know how to do it. Who's heard of a cosmic calendar? Ha! Got you. Oh, there's always one. So the cosmic calendar is a way of wrapping your brain around big chunks of time. In this instance, 13 billion years of time. Astronomers and astrophysicists realized that this is tricky, so they came up with this idea where the 1st of January is the Big Bang, and the 31st of December is right now. And if you compress all that time across the calendar, it helps you sort of see how time is really, in the words of Douglas Adams, really, really big. He was talking about space, but time and space, really, really big. September, that's when life first shows up in the solar system, right? Everything we know as human existence is in that final day, December 31st. Everything we know as archaeology is in the final minute of December 31st. So think about time, right? And I found this so useful that I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to have one of these for post-glacial Britain? So I made one. It's not nearly as pretty. But the conceit here is that January 1st, New Year's Day, the last glacier has melted. And December 31st is the year 2000 for ease of calculation. I will have to update this eventually. But if we look at this at a glance, we can see here in Britain, we're hunter-gatherers for almost 6 months. And how many people here have heard about the Mesolithic as sort of a throwaway line? Oh yes, we were hunter-gatherers, but then farming came and everything was important. But 6 months of that time. Now the Romans were only here for less than a fortnight, and they cluttered up the place. I mean, they dominate all of our lesson plans in the schools, they dominate the television, they dominate Nick's life. The Romans were everywhere, but they're not even a fortnight. So if we think about time like this, it can be really, really helpful in understanding just how big time is that separates us from certain periods. Now, the reason I do this in the context of this talk is because the goldy bit here at the end of September, that's the late Bronze Age. And the first 3 weeks of October is pretty much with that late Bronze Age, so 4 weeks of time, that's when hill forts are being constructed in this part of the world. It's also 4 weeks of time what separates us here today from the 2nd of December, which is the Battle of Hastings. So that's a huge chunk of time. If we wanted to look at structures constructed in the month of December, just like we're thinking about hill forts constructed in the month of October, we could then say that Windsor Castle, a lovely Norman castle, and a 1940s prefab were precisely the same thing because they have doors and windows and people live in them, right? So it's the same thing. Call them all houses. But we know that's a nonsense because the earlier Norman castle is built as a weapon of war and then it morphs into different uses over time. So was probably Ivanhoe Beacon, constructed in the late Bronze Age as this big, important thing, we don't know what for, but possibly used for different things over the next 3 weeks, if you like. Whereas some of the hill forts constructed in the middle of October would have been built by different people for different purposes. So that's where we get that variety. They're not all different because it's different tribes doing different things. It's because we have this huge temporal span. And that helps us to realize why there's such variation in the hill forts across the Chilterns. Now I'm going to talk about how we look at the landscape around these hill forts in the Chilterns. Everybody knows that when it's really nice and dry and you fly over an open field, you get to see archaeology. And I'm sure everyone has seen crop marks either in the news or on Google Earth. A nerd like me, he'll spend hours at night just looking at Google Earth for archaeology. And this is South Stoke, obviously. And that's a great way to prospect for archaeology. However, if the bulk of the area you are interested in, forget that, if the bulk of the area you're interested in is under deciduous tree cover, 28% of the AONB, then you need to do something about that. And so, we turn to LiDAR because my request for napalm was denied. Got to get rid of the trees. So, who here knows what LiDAR is? Archaeologists, don't put your hands up. Okay, a fair few. But not enough to justify me skipping these slides, so that's good. It's a backronym, light detection and ranging, which is rubbish. It's just, we wanted to have, as if I invented it, wanted to have light-dar as opposed to sonar, sound, radar, radio waves. LiDAR, light detection and ranging. And without getting into all the nitty-gritty, you are essentially bombarding the surface of the Earth with a lot of laser points. And normally I like to have a little laser pointer, which I've completely forgotten to bring. But to show that if you point a little laser, you know, the kind you torment the cat with, little laser dot on your hand, it's quite small. But if I shone it at the back of the room, it would be about the size of maybe a 10p coin. If you shine it from an airplane that's 3,000 feet in the air, it's about the size of a dinner plate. And as that dinner plate of light filters down through the tree canopy, lots of little bits and pieces of light will bounce off things. Sometimes for every pulse, you can get up to 12 parts of it bouncing off. Now, why is that important? Well, because of that wonderful formula we all forgot from school. If we know time and speed, we can calculate distance. So we know the speed of light, and we know how quickly that bounces back up to the receiver. So we get a very, very accurate measurement. This is flying up and down in transects over the area you're interested in, and it's pulsing out that laser sometimes up to 1 million pulses a minute. So in the database that I have for the Chilterns, there are 64 billion measurements. And what do we do with that? Well, we create a digital model. So this is meant to look fuzzy. This is the point cloud of the wood. It's a slice, a section through the woods outside of Nettlebed. And you can see it's reconstructed perfectly, both the humps and bumps in the ground, but also all the trees. And we call that a digital surface model. And then we get rid of everything on the surface we're not interested in. So here you can see where it's recreated all these lovely trees, and then we delete them. And we can see a very, very boring section of no humps and bumps. But this is what LiDAR will do for you. It's important to look at this because you might say, why did I spend £130,000 of project money on a LiDAR survey when the Environment Agency has helpfully done LiDAR all around the country? Well, at the time the project started, the Environment Agency had only done the places the Environment Agency was interested in, which is the bits that flood. And I know I said not all hill forts are on hills, but most of them bloody are. And hills don't flood. So there was no Environment Agency data for the bits and pieces I was interested in. Also, the Environment Agency has now flown most of the country and made their data available, but they fly at 2-meter resolution, so it's a lot coarser resolution than what I've commissioned this one at, which is a 25 centimeter resolution. Now, those numbers don't really mean anything, so I like to demonstrate. This is 2-meter resolution. That's 1-meter resolution. That's 25 centimeter resolution. We'll do it this way. 1-meter resolution, 25 centimeter resolution. And you can suddenly see, hopefully, all of these different features popping out. I like to call this my Specsavers slide. 1 or 2. Better now or now. So you can see it really was good value for money to do this over the entire Chilterns. And to demonstrate that, I will show you a bit from the North Chilterns. This is Tottenham. Anyone been to Tottenham? Lovely Motte and Bailey Castle, which you can just see here. Beautiful hill fort, Maiden Bower, stunning. Those of you that know how to read your crop marks will see the soil marks showing some field enclosures, so these would have been hedgerows. It's pretty much all you can see, even if the image was short. So allow me to show you what the LiDAR will do for you in that same landscape. So not only can you see the hill fort really, really nicely, but over on the left, your left, the left-hand side, you can see I hold lots of ridge and furrow, lots of medieval ridge and furrow. So agricultural landscape that is very, very densely used and well preserved. You can see a lot more of the Motte and Bailey enclosure, and you can see these wonderful lynchets coming down this hillside, and we'll come on to lynchets shortly. But for me, the thing that made me most excited about this image, can you see these little lines here? It's part of a coaxial field system. This is a later prehistoric field system. It's in these fields, which have been ploughed, I believe the professional word is tubuggery, over the last 500 years. And yet we are still seeing the ditch and bank, tiny little earthwork enclosures that make up these strip field systems. LiDAR does not see what's under the ground. LiDAR can't see the sort of stuff that a geophysical survey will show you. If it's a flat ground, ploughed completely flat, it will show you nothing. But the fact that it can show you humps and bumps means that those field systems still exist in a field that's been ploughed over and over and over and over again. You can't see them with the naked eye. You can barely see them when you're walking. You feel them with your feet as you walk over them. But they're there. And what was really exciting for me and for my colleague on the project, I should mention Dr. Ed Pedler, worked with me on this project for 3 years. This made us really excited because we thought if that kind of, not really ephemeral, but really fragile archaeology was still out there to be seen, what would we discover across the entire Chilterns? So initially, when I came on board, I was supposed to just do the green bits, but I'm terribly greedy, and I also know how to make brass scream when you squeeze it. So for my 130,000, I actually got the largest survey ever done of this type in the UK, and the third largest in the world, 1,440 square kilometres at that resolution. The only other ones that are as big are Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the Mayan jungles. The Amazon's creeping up on us. And somebody, Dave Cowley in Scotland, has flown 1,000 square kilometres, but I was glad he stopped because I was like, I still have the biggest one in Britain. Not that size is everything, but it is quite nice. So we have all that data, 64 billion data points, and just me and Ed on the project, and at that time, 3.5 years of funding. So we learned really quickly that we were not going to be able to get through it all. So we turned to the idea of citizen science. Now, who's heard of this portal? Great. Okay. Clearly I've been getting the word out these last 5 years. But it's still up and running for another 5 years, so do go on it. We created a web app that you could, rather than sort of hoard all this lovely LiDAR data like Gollum and be like, oh, we'll drip feed something to the press occasionally. We put it out immediately for everybody to look at and for people to help us find archaeology. So in 2019, we rolled out the Beacon to the Past portal. Create an account, it's free, log on, get your password. There are little boxes you tick that say that you won't use it for commercial development purposes, that you won't metal detect without permission of the landowner, and that you won't, publish a book on the Chilterns without telling me first, because I'm doing it now. But you agree to all those things, and then you're in. And you get to there's a mosquito. You get to pan around all of the area that we've surveyed. And like Google Earth, you can turn up layers on and off. You've got aerial photography you can look at. You can look at historic mapping from 1860 to 1880. You can look at 2 different ways of visualizing it. You'll note that this looks a lot flatter than that image I showed you of Chiltern House. So there's 2 different ways of, well, there are many different ways, but there are 2 good ways of looking at the archaeology through the LiDAR. And one of them is called the local relief model, so it makes it a bit flatter. The other one is called the hillshade model. It makes it sort of 3D. They both have their uses. So they're both here. You can turn those on. You can turn on the scheduled monuments so that you don't get excited about finding archaeology everybody already knew about. But I'm going to use this one that we know about. This is West Wickham Hill Fort with the Dashwood Mausoleum destroying my entrance. But that's just to the north of, it's to the west of Wickham, isn't it? But it's mostly to the north. And for demonstration purposes, you grab this little pencil tool and you draw a box around it and you fill in the questionnaire. What do you think it is? Why do you think it's that? And it feeds right into a massive database. We have had over 12,000 entries in the first 2 years. I think we're up to about 18,000 now. It's starting to taper off a little bit. But and what happens to those entries, yes, you can see the Chiltern is broken out in a rash. Every one of those little red marks is a polygon drawn by a volunteer who has found something. Everything from saw pits in woods, woodland banks, all sorts of things. Now, we have, as I said, thousands of volunteers doing this. We have about 50 more highly trained, so they sat through a lot of tutorials and workshops with my colleague on how to read LiDAR, and they went through all of those entries and sort of vetted them. They didn't get through all of them yet, but they have gone through something like 7,000. And why are they vetting them? Well, for one reason, people might not be really confident about what they've selected. They could have said, well, I think that was a alien landing strip or something, and we want to take that out of the database. It might well be, and this actually happened once, and this is a weakness of LiDAR. LiDAR can only tell you what it thinks it sees. We had someone ring us up early days, and they were so excited they found a new Bronze Age barrow, so nice big tumulus. And they marked it as such in the database, and we looked at where it was and thought, gosh, it's funny that none of the antiquarians ever noticed that before, but yeah, it looks like one in the LiDAR. So we got in the car and went to go visit it, and of course, it was in the corner of a field. It was Farmer Giles' manure dump. LiDAR cannot tell the difference. A mound is a mound. So it's very important to sort of field check these things. And then the third reason we had this is because and we only had to remove 2 of these in 4 years, which isn't bad. But if you do allow small boys to draw on the landscape, maybe even large boys, the Romans would be very proud. Let's just leave it at that. So a couple of images needed to be taken off. Somebody really doesn't like amateurs, I'll tell you that one. So anyway, all of those good pieces of information fed into the definitive database. So all of these blue marks are the 7,000 some odd records that have been vetted and approved, if you like. And what happens to that information? Well, it's fed to the 4 different HERs so that those unknown sites now have protection through the planning process. Lots of these sites were chalk extraction pits, charcoal platforms, saw pits, medieval wood boundaries, the sort of thing that isn't going to get everybody excited. But there were at least 500, I think the number was 512, sites that were significant. So late Iron Age settlements, snatches of Roman road that we didn't know were there before, little pieces of Grim Stitch added on that we didn't know about. Lots of sort of exciting sites as well. Here's just a couple of stats. 22,000 unique users. Now, full disclosure, a full third of those are Russian bots. Accounts that were created and never used and all have a .ru URL. But a lot of people are genuine. And so we've had over 18,000 features recorded by the citizen scientists. 590, not 512. And it represents almost 8,000 hours of work undertaken by volunteers who could not have done this on our own, Ed and I. Now, what sort of exciting things did we find? Well, if you looked at the newspaper back in 2020, yes, it was the anniversary of the launch, so yes, it would have been 2020, August 19th. Or August 11th, we went public with finding a new hill fort, which is exciting. It was great fun for my colleagues who had just sent the final draft of the definitive atlas of hill forts in Britain and Ireland to the publisher. And I did ring them up and say, do you want to add another one? They were like, oh way! Maybe the 2nd edition? No, never again, they said. So this one's not in the atlas, but it is definitely a hill fort. You can see my colleague Ed there. It's a human scale. We're well in pandemic because we're wearing masks outdoors. But lovely ditch and bank, very well preserved. I would love to tell you where it is, but the gentleman that owns it helped write the press release so that it would be very murky and that no one would know where it is. I am still hoping to convince him to let me tell people more about it and to visit it and perhaps to even do some work on it. But I think maybe based on my own enthusiasm for hill forts, he was under the impression that if the world knew there was a hill fort, everyone would want to come see it. And I'm thinking, oh no, it's just me. But I can't tell you where it is, but I can tell you it is in the southern Chilterns. And I can tell you that it is probably very close. If I was playing a hotter, colder child's game, of all the talks I've given over the last 4 years, you're the closest to it. So that's a watch this space. Yes, the hill fort was very exciting to have discovered, but there were so many more things that were exciting, and this comes on more to what comes out of the LiDAR in this area. This is obviously not the Chilterns. This is prizes. Anyone know where this is? Verdrip Downs, Wiltshire. Verdrip Down, Wiltshire. Lovely hill fort, and then these field systems. So these are what they look like when they're really robust and looking good. There are a lot of prehistoric landscapes that look like this, where you have lovely hill fort, and then on the slopes around them there is evidence of a lot of agricultural activity that probably predates the hill fort and postdates it. Field systems notoriously hard to date. But one of the things that was always said about the Chilterns, since a paper was published in '73 by a guy called Charlie Saunders, and he said, Celtic field systems, that's what these kind of field systems are sometimes called. That's a whole other talk about why that's not a good label. But Celtic field systems, he said, were practically absent in most of the Chilterns. They exist somewhere in Hertfordshire, but practically absent from most of the Chilterns. Whereas on the North Wessex Downs, the other side of the river, it's stuffed with them. If you've ever seen like the pictures of the Lambourne Downs, just absolutely beautiful, lovely field systems. But he said no, it was because the Chilterns were tree covered, backwater, and it's probably not a very nice place to be. Well, we've proven that wrong. So you remember those field systems that I showed you, the little coaxial strips at Tottenham? Well, we have found hundreds of those across the Chilterns. And in a nice piece of work that my colleague is writing up for me, I hope, but it was his idea, he noticed it. In some of those field systems, oh, I'm sorry, puppy. I know, it's terribly boring. But in some of those field systems, in the corners, there are dark pits showing up in the LiDAR. And Ed's thought was, those are probably marling pits. So what you would do is, in the late Iron Age, and again into the early Roman period, you're farming your little field system, and you've been farming it for ages, and the soil's getting pretty thin and not really very fertile, and you've tried putting all the cow manure on it, but you need to do something a little more. So you up your game by putting chalk into you till chalk into the soil. So you get that chalk out of these marling pits. It's called marling. Well, you wouldn't put those pits in the center of your field, you put them in the corner. So we have these lovely little dark pits, and then we have the white lines of the field systems around them, like a child's connect the dot puzzle. But in places that aren't protected by tree cover, in fields that have been plowed and plowed and plowed, we see just lots of regularly spaced dark pits. No little white lines. So Ed very cleverly thought, what if those pits are proxies for even more field systems? It's just that the humps and bumps of the field systems have been plowed away. So once we did that and started looking at the landscape, we realized we had hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of field systems. So this is not a tree-covered landscape in the Chiltern, back in the day. We're right on par with North Wessex Downs, across the river. We're just as important. We're not a backwater. And it means that there's a lot of population density at that point in time too. This isn't just random people living in sporadic settlements around the Chilterns. So we've changed the narrative of what the Chilterns looked like then. And that brings me on to the agricultural landscape around where we are now. So this is what Bowsdown Camp looks like with the trees off of it. And this is just at the edge here of, we're over here, I've got a better picture in a minute. I just wanted you to see the extent of the hill fort once you get all the vegetation off of it. And now, for your eyes only, what it might have looked like in the past.
Wow.
So this will be going up on an interpretation panel. I need to have some discussions with the right people to find out where we put that. And it might actually end up going like on a wall of the village hall or something like that. But there will be an interpretation panel of which this will be the key piece of artwork on it. And this is Mark Gridley's interpretation drawn on the LiDAR, the contours, Hashore plans, and a little bit of excavation that was done there in the 30s and again in the 60s. So he's got good evidence for most of this. My favourite part of this is the untamed Thames, which we tend to forget pre-canalisation would have been very braided and sort of wild and a fantastic riverscape. And of course, we're just over here. So yes, that's feast your eyes. So if we look a little bit more closely, we can see here these fantastic lynchets that are here. They show up beautifully in the LiDAR. And I think I've got this two visualizations, yes. So to describe the two different visualizations and what they can bring out for you, this is the multi-hillshade visualization of this area. And again, we've taken all the trees off and we've taken all the buildings away. So if it looks a little alien, that's why. And we can also see, hopefully you can see the river, which the river always comes off as sort of a triangulated, weird thing in LiDAR because the laser doesn't bounce off the water. So when you process the data, the algorithm gets all confused and tries to join up dots randomly, and it gives you this lovely, smooth sort of series of triangles. But here you can see you've got these lovely lynchets, and you also have, I hope you can see them, field divisions here. Now some of those are going to be medieval, but we do have, if we look at the second visualization, this is the local relief model. So instead of counting on the way the shadow shows you the contours, this plays with the differences in elevation but flattens out the contours. So for reading this, light is high and dark is low. So you can see extraction pits here, and you can see holloways or roads, and the light bits you can see then are little banks, and some of these will be woodland banks under the tree cover, but also you can see field systems again here. And one of the useful things to do is to show them up like this. Ignore the big square. That's an error in the database. But you can see here some of the polygon records that have been made. So you can see the Lynchets there, that's the hill fort over there, and you can see the type of field system is different. So we have some are like this, which we might consider almost to be more coaxial, and then you've got some that are just following the contour here. What are the dates of these field systems? I cannot tell you. Very, very difficult. Sometime between the later prehistoric period and the medieval period. So that's not very helpful, is it? So how do we know that it is, although it is probably post-Iron Age in this bit? Well, we have to think about how farming was done. Everybody thinks, yes, that's the lovely farm, that's what it would have looked like in the, the Neolithic. We've stopped hunting and gathering, we've decided to plant things, and it's just like gladiator walking through and touching that. No, this is modern farming, because, as I like to say, prehistoric farming was hard work. This is an ard. This is a modern farming is harrowing. Very good. Tapping my inner Spike Milligan. Anyway, basically, for thousands of years, the way you broke up the soil was using a sharp, pointy stick, and it's not really much more elaborate than that. An ard is a fire-hardened, sharp, pointy stick that either you and your mates or your domesticated animals pull and scratch along the earth. And that allows you, and don't they look happy, it's sometimes called a scratch plough, and what it literally does is put scratches in the earth. It's not turning the soil over, there's no moldboard plough here, it's just making scratches. Sometimes we're really lucky and archaeologically we can see them. I've been fortunate on Sark, on an excavation there, to actually, that's not that one, to excavate a few ard marks, that they are rare as rocking horse poo. And so are the ards themselves. So this is from the excavation done by Oxford Archaeology. Colleagues of mine did this at Eton Rowing Lake. And you can see here is an ard, perfectly preserved because it's been in an anaerobic environment. But they are very, very rare. But what you did was you made those scratches and then you threw your seed and hoped for the best. And of course we know that this happened because when we look at charred seed collections from this period of time, there's all things like vetch and mustard and all sorts of weeds and stuff in it as well. So you can well imagine what you want is coming up in the cracks where you've encouraged it to grow, and everything else is growing stuff you don't particularly want. So when does that all change? Well, as you can imagine, if all you've got is a sharp, pointy stick, you're going to want soft soils for the most part. So we're talking floodplain stuff. We're talking about soft loams and well-draining gravel types of geologies. But then, the Iron Age. As soon as you can make an iron shoe for your ard, that just literally slips over the end of your ard, and suddenly you can turn over flinty clay soils, you can turn over all sorts of stuff with that, because that will not break like your sharp pointy stick. You're still largely making big scratches. It doesn't get much more sophisticated until the very end of the Iron Age and into the Roman period. But you can now get up on these slopes. You can start to cut terraces in, these lynchets. You can start to maximize your production, and it's all because of this little ard shoe. And when people ask me, what do you think was the greatest thing about iron? Was it swords and people could defend themselves? It's like, no, that is the most important thing. Absolutely the most important thing. Okay, so probably the last thing I'm going to really talk about is the limitations of the LiDAR for looking at this particular landscape. What I can tell you about living in this part of the world in prehistory is that it was a farmed landscape, very much into its farming, and it seems particularly appropriate to be saying that inside a building that smells wonderfully of onions and is reminiscent of farming as a child. I grew up on a little farm. So this is very much an agricultural landscape. However, although that's what the LiDAR tells us, it can also fool us. And I did mention earlier about tumuli that don't exist. There's this wonderful thing here at the top of this slope, and we look at it, the different visualization. It's this lovely lozenge. It's an upraised bit, and if I didn't know anything about the area and was rapidly scanning it, I'd be like, oh, on a prominent area. It's a Neolithic long barrow. That's very exciting. But we have to look at other aspects of evidence, not just the LiDAR. And in this instance, we look at the historic mapping, and it's called the rabbit banks. Well, then suddenly we have to think, all right, is that probably related to rabbit warrening? very likely. But again, without walking up there, and you know this landscape better than I do, I'm still just guessing. So rapid assessment of LiDAR can't tell you everything. There are a lot of limitations. And again, I'm going to come back to the South Stoke. Look at all that fantastic archaeology. I mean, it's a scheduled area, it is brilliant. You've got all those ring ditches, Bronze Age ring ditches, lovely trackway. This is what the LiDAR revealed. Nothing. And that's because there are no humps and bumps for it to measure. It's all flat. So if we only looked at LiDAR, we'd be left with a really gappy idea of what the archaeology is. If we didn't do the LiDAR, again, we'd be left with only seeing what we could see, you know, in ploughed areas. We wouldn't be able to see what was underneath the tree cover. And so it's really important to remember that there's all these different threads of data that pull together. Geophysical survey, responsible metal detecting, which we're going to hear about in a little bit. All of those things add evidence to the story. Right, the last thing I'm going to just mention is, I could talk about the project for ages, but I won't. The project ended 31st of October after extending it, and it was supposed to last 3.5 years, but I bullied lottery into it being 5. When it was over, I convinced the Conservation Board that I shouldn't go anywhere, and what they really wanted was a permanent archaeologist to continue to witter at them. So they said yes, I could stay, and I am now the Heritage and Archaeology Manager. Do not ever let me choose my own job title. I am that ham. I wanted to be the Archaeology Research Site Expert, but they said you can't put that acronym in a signature. So I've come up with this initiative called CHAP, another great acronym. Chilterns Heritage and Archaeology Partnership. It's modelled on the highly successful Chalk Streams Partnership. The Chilterns has been running for 25 years. That's a voice for chalk streams. I will be the CHAP. Who is the voice for archaeology and heritage across the Chilterns. And there will be a number of services that CHAP provides. Again, the sorts of things we started in the project, but these lottery-funded projects are finite, and the money runs out, and then nothing happens. So it will be continuing to give management advice to landowners, to engaging with communities, coming and giving talks, talking in schools, and most importantly, from my point of view, is getting the word out there that the Chilterns has a very rich history. And we can all learn a lot more about it. And starting next summer, I will be operating a field school within the Chilterns, so a 4 to 6 week excavation where anybody can come and learn how to dig. That'll probably be somewhere in the central Chilterns, but it'll be a movable feast over the next 25 years in my vision for the Chilterns. Just to show you one of the projects that I'm just starting on, this famous regional monument, which I'm sure you all recognise, but it might help if we take the trees off. This is Bledlow Cross, Bledlow Ridge. Anyone? Yeah? And Bledlow Tumulus. So this is on Lord Carrington's estate, and the first thing that CHAP did was secure some money from the Farming and Protected Landscapes, from FIPL, to basically create a heritage trail. Hello, Mr. Wasp. A heritage trail from Blether's Mound, which is this tumulus, down to Blether's Cross, which is on Blether's Ridge. These mutated into Bledlow. But the story has always been that there's this Danish warrior, Blether, and he's died and buried in here, and they carved that chalk cross to commemorate him, and the whole area bears his name. Again, on shreds of evidence, there's no dating at all. So what this project is doing is clearing the cross, getting dating for the cross, will be the first chalk monument in the Chilterns to have a proper date to it, except for the Whipsnade lion, we know when they did that one. And there's a skull that was hoiked out of here by an enthusiastic vicar in the 19th century, and it lives in a cardboard box in Buckinghamshire. So we'll get a date from that. I suspect that's going to be Bronze Age. That very well might be Blether's Cross, we shall see. And then there'll be a circular trail with interpretation panels and all that sort of thing. And Lord Carrington has taken the trail I've mapped out and has handed it over to Bucks as a public right-of-way. So that in perpetuity, that's open up. You can go through thick thorn wood and all that sort of thing. So we've gone from it being completely cut tree covered to finally opening it up. So that's the cross. It used to be that you could see it as you drove along at the bottom. And it will be that way again. So that's just one of the projects that CHAP is starting to pick up. Hopefully there'll be all sorts of things like that going on all over the Chilterns. If you're interested in CHAP or anything else archaeologically, Visit the portal at chilternsbeacons.org. Look at all the lovely LiDAR. If you are amongst the Twitterati, you can find me at Hillfortian. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Wendy. Just thinking, for the question and answer, could you go back to the LiDAR image of Hardwick? Because I expect people might have some things to ask or point out. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much. That was riveting. So there's space now for questions or people who have other little bits of knowledge or things they want to point out on the map. So yeah, the floor is
Or
open.
maybe Danny could come and show us.
Or, oh
where
yes,
some of
that's
the
right.
finds
Yeah,
come
good
from
point.
on the map.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, Danny, do you want to come and say something about what you found and
Yeah.
how it fits in?
I'm not sure where it is on that map, but I can explain
I
to.
can point to where it is.
My name's Danny Jones. I'm a local lad living in Henley-on-Thames. I'm a local metal detectorist, and about 3 years ago, my daughter, who's here now, Lily, she sent some emails out to local landowners for permission to metal detect on their land, and lucky enough, we managed to get hold of Tolly. I'm assuming you all know Tolly, Ian?
We all know.
Yeah, so Tolly kindly gave me permission to metal detect on his land, and 3 days later I brought a lot of finds that I found for you all to see, ranging from, I should imagine, I found a worked flint, which is quite a nice item, a lot of quite a mixture of Roman coins, and I think most of them are late Roman coins. But what was your name?
Nick.
Nick. Going by the size of the coins, because I'm not expert on Roman, I would say they're the latest side of the Roman coins, because the early period of Roman, they were much bigger and much heavier. So I found quite a lot of Roman, which says to me there was possibly a lot of Roman activity in the area. And most of my finds, if you know the area well, you've got Lynn's veg shed one side. Most of the finds that you're seeing over there on the table were all found on the far side, Tolly's plots to...
The upper side, okay? The
Yeah.
upper forestry field, yeah.
Yeah, so most of them have been found in there. Really, I've probably only had about a dozen visits, so it shows the amount of archaeology there is and activity in the area by the amount of finds that I've got on the table on quite a really small area. So hopefully, you know, if we can sort of get a team together and stretch out a bit farther afield, I'll be surprised. There must be so much more for us to find and date the area.
Great, and you're all welcome to go and have a look.
And you're all welcome. If you look to the left of the table, that's all that's been found on Tolly's fields, the Hardwick estate. To the right of the table is all found. Basically, I've got 4 permissions, all mainly in Henley, 3 in Henley and this one here. So the Hardwick estate is to the left and the Henley area is to the right. And I've also recently, a year ago, just stumbled upon, on a permission of mine, a Second World War crash Spitfire. And I did a lot of research on that, and I managed to find out who the pilot was, who was sadly killed in the accident. I've been and visited his grave up in North London, and I brought a few of the smaller artefacts for you to all have a look at. So, yeah, is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to say, particularly thanks to Danny for setting such a good,
no problem.
such a good example, because I don't know if you saw in The Guardian about 4 months ago, if you read it, it was picked up by other newspapers as well. They wrote this article about how archaeologists and metal detectors are always at loggerheads, and how archaeologists hate detectorists, and nothing could be further from the truth for myself and a lot of my colleagues. There are archaeologists that are out there that, you know, view all metal detectorists as being bad or whatever. There are always going to be a few rotten apples, and yes, you've probably read about the prosecutions of people that illegally, what's called night hawking, and they dig stuff up without permission and they flog it on eBay, and that's stealing from all of us. But most detectorists are like Danny here, and if you look at the artifact, you will see he's got printouts from the Portable Antiquities Scheme. So the Portable Antiquities Scheme is entirely voluntary, but is so helpful. You find something, you report it. They don't take your stuff away, but they record it. They take a photograph. If you don't know what it is, they tell you what it is. And then researchers like me can come along and go, I wonder if there were ever any Roman brooches found in Hardwick. Well, if they were all flogged to some American on eBay, then we would never know. And I'd be like, oh, there were never any Romans here. But because of the hard work that people like Danny are doing, and that's going into the PAS, I can go onto that database and go, oh wow, there were 70 brooches found. Wow, something big was happening here. I made that number up. But it's a really important scheme, so I encourage any of you, if you are detectorists, or if you're going to go out on Christmas Day and get you a brand new metal detector and go and do stuff, if you find anything, log on to the Portable Antiquity Scheme, find out who your flow is, your finds liaison officer. They're always great people, they're so helpful, and just tell them what you got, because it's really wonderful, and it shares it with everybody. So that's my bit on detecting.
One other thing though, if you do get into metal detecting, you do need to get permission to metal detect. You can't just buy a detector and detect.
Absolutely.
Like through hard work and contacting the local farmers like Tolly, or through word of mouth.
And on scheduled monuments, it's a prosecutable offence.
Yes.
So no detecting on that sort of thing.
I've got a question about the LiDAR of Hardwick. So what I don't understand is those steep slopes that the lynchets are on, up Path Hill, so the ones that go like vertically and the ones that go sideways, those ones there, they're on the super steep slopes. Was the population really so dense people needed to farm those super steep slopes?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
So people always ask me what was
Why?
the population during the Iron Age, what was the population during the Roman period, and it really is one of those how long's a piece of string things. So if 50 years ago we would have told you that the population pre-Roman was less than 1 million in the whole country, and now, I mean, I'll ask Nick because you do a lot more in the Roman period, but I think we'd be well happy with more than 2 million in that period. Every time we discover a new site, we realise that so there were more people living in this area.
But why would they ever have chosen to farm there rather than the flat? There's so many flatter bits. Why would they have made so much effort to farm these super steep slopes?
And remember, there's also pastoral activity going on as well. So it's one of those things where it's like, why would they? Yeah. There's a lot of why would they. Why would they build at Flag Fen? Why would you build out on stilts in a swampy area? Why would you do these sort of things? So we just can't get into their heads. But I do think, the short answer to that is that yes, the population is probably a lot denser than we thought, and there's nothing on the telly, so you may as well plough it. There's nothing else to do. But that's true as well. Yeah,
there's all the
so you'd have drainage issues there.
Yeah. But there's all
And
the
you've got
tops,
nice south-facing slope there as well.
True. So my other question is, because we did have this little sneaky preview of this from some other people from the Beacons of the Past project who came and did a little presentation to a couple of us at Hardwick. Names? SOAG.
Okay.
SOAG people.
I'm the only Beacon person.
SOAG people who were using your data.
Yes.
And they suggested that those south-facing lines that we're looking at, terraces, could be Roman terraces, because they were saying that Romans...
Here we go with wine, is it?
Yes, wine, exactly. So is that not true?
I think it's probably very wishful thinking.
Okay.
I will use the wonderfully diplomatic phrase that my mentor Barry Cunliffe taught me, which was, it may well be right, but there is no evidence to support it.
Okay.
So, that's possible, but we've got nothing.
Okay.
I can visualise the lynches going up Path Hill. I always have visualised them going up Path Hill. Lynches on the west side, lynches larger. So, two things. One, what's the difference between a lynch and a lynchette? Is a lynchette a small lynch?
No, it's colloquialism, isn't it? We call them lynchettes, not lynchette, but just with one T. But it could be called a lynch.
The same in size or whatever.
Absolutely.
Whatever the size is. You know. And Miriam's point, I've always imagined. Sorry. Just your point is, I would always imagine again that the population would want to be close in, and therefore they would plough and do what they could as close as they could to security.
We do have that vision of the prehistoric period being a terribly hostile and violent time, and everybody trying to take away everything from you. But I think we're changing that as well. Sorry?
There was always a different tribe on the other side of the river.
Well, again, that whole tribal thing comes out of the Roman interpretation of the people that they encountered, right? And the example I like to use is when Europeans first went to North America, and dealt with Native American tribes and thought, well, okay, I understand it, you're all Sioux. But they weren't all Sioux, they were all different smaller groups and tribes, but because there weren't names for them, that's what the mappers called them. The Romans were very much the same. So, oh, you're all the Belgae, and that sounds like the people we met in Gaul, so they must be the Belgae too. It's because we're dealing with a population that isn't, I don't want to call them illiterate, they're non-literate, so they're not writing down records. We only have the Romans to go by, and if they tell us that these are tribes, then we kind of go by that. But I think we're moving away from that idea. So I doubt that you had people, fighting across the river at each other, and I think it's mostly just people proud of their communities. They're making installations like hill forts for that purpose, to put their stamp on their local area. But I don't think they're fighting each other all the time. There's just not the evidence for it. There was a question about what is a lynchet.
For those who may not know what a lynch typically is.
Yeah. So a lynchet is basically it is a product of agricultural ploughing, if you like, or at least arding, and it's kind of like terracing. It can be deliberate, like terracing, or also a lynchet is the soil that builds up at the bottom of your field if your field's on a slope, and you can imagine as you're moving that soil, you get this sort of bank that forms. On a slope like this, they're quite deliberate.
Did you find? Can you tell us about any Neolithic finds?
Did we encounter anything Neolithic in the LiDAR? Racking my brains.
Causewayed enclosures, for example.
Nothing new. No. We have a better understanding of like Wallard's Bank at Luton, which is a D-shaped enclosure right in the centre of Marsh Farm. The LiDAR's allowed us to map it a lot better. Whiteleaf Hill, but we've seen the barrow excavated, so it's not really added anything to that landscape. So the Neolithic and the Mesolithic have not done well out of LiDAR, but they will respond better to excavation, I think. Even in Bulstrode Camp, which is a hill fort at Gerrard's Cross, there's some hint of a Neolithic long barrow that was the focus of that long before the hill fort was constructed, but the LiDAR doesn't really shed any light on that because it's all completely flat. So, unfortunate. The medieval field system, or the medieval woodland boundaries have done very well out of the LiDAR, so the saw pits.
Did anyone ever stick a bronze point on an ard?
Do you know they must have done at some point in time? In that entire long month of September, somebody must have thought, let's do that, and they probably would have done exactly what the people who used bronze axes to chop trees did. Thought, well, that's nice, but the flint worked a lot better. So yeah, it's a soft metal, and I don't think they'd have stuck with that very long.
Have you got your interpretation overlay for that? That's everything you've got.
That's everything that's been vetted.
Vetted so far.
Yeah, so there will be other stuff that's been identified. In fact, if you want, we can get you on the reviewer panel if you would like to go into the review portal.
Yeah.
Because you know what you're doing with
Well,
LiDAR.
I've got an idea. I've got it before. That's not quite close enough, actually.
Need to get
So
closer.
I was going to ask you a
Me
question.
too.
What ultimately is going to happen to the LiDAR data? Because you're saying the HER, the
So-
historic environment records, will get the individual records of
Yep.
the things that you've identified. For the
So-
data itself, does it get?
I was really keen on a legacy for this data.
Yeah.
This is really, really important. So many things have happened. Every HER has gotten, with a 5 kilometre buffer, a clip of all the ASCII files, the original raw data, and the visualization. So each of the 4 HERs has their patch,
Okay.
in addition to the features that have been found. The LiDAR portal is up for another 5 years, so that's open to everybody. Anyone that wants the raw data just has to ask me, send me a shapefile, and they will get the raw data. And it lives with the Conservation Board in perpetuity. Now what I'm trying to do is to convince Historic England, and it's early days in the conversation, but I'm trying to convince Historic England to invest in creating a national archive for LiDAR like they have for photographs. You can go to Swindon and look at any of the photographs. We need to have a single repository for LiDAR because yes, this is the biggest one in the country, but there are lots of little LiDAR projects going on and that data is just floating around God knows where. The ADS is not the answer because it's too expensive to sort of get them to upload a terabyte of data. Historic England, I think, needs to step up.
Yeah.
So I'm having early conversations with people on that, like Ian Morrison, no relation, and see if we can get that ball rolling. But for now, it lives with the Conservation Board, and anybody who wants any can have it.
Legacy is always such a difficult thing when you do these.
Absolutely.
You do a funded project for some certain number of years.
Yeah, I was thinking about legacy on day one. What happens to this stuff, and what happens to all of our volunteers that have learned all these skills? You can't just leave them.
No.
So.
If you go back to the LiDAR picture, I found the field running north south with all the lynchets in.
Oh,
and have
right.
done for 25 years, and those lynchets aren't visible on the ground. It's curious what it picks up because those. I mean, I must have walked it 1,000 times probably, and I have some training in field archaeology. I've never seen those lynchets, but what there are, and they look similar to the ones in the woodland, which is kind of at right angles to that. Now those are very large and obvious when you're in the woodland. And in the field we're talking about, which is Rosedam, there are clearly, it's been ploughed across those lynchets with a non-reversible plough, meaning in other words it left little ridges and little dips. Those don't show at all, but they're visible on the ground.
So I think that's probably a factor of the algorithm of the processing of the data. So it will have taken out structures that are regular like that, so that you don't get. If you look at the local relief model of, say, a cricket pitch, you don't pick up the mowing patterns, which are visible with the naked eye and actually are a difference in elevation.
But these are a difference in elevation, and they are indeed archaeology. I mean, they date
Yes.
from, say, 1970 or something like that, and they're from ploughing before reversible ploughs came in, where they left these little ridges and little tiny ditches, at intervals.
Right.
On the
I'd
lands.
be really interested to see that on the ground and compare it to a closer zoomed in version of that and see if it can be seen. Have you been? You haven't been on the portal, so if you want to jump on the portal and have a look.
I have used LiDAR.
Excellent.
But not in this. I have looked in this area, but I'm not sure whose portal it was. There's what resolution is the Environment Agency?
I think it's 1 metre for this area. So.
Me again. So when we had the SOAG presentation, so I'm going to get up again, there was something that was identified which is somewhere here. Is it this?
Well, yeah,
It's not
that's
that, is
why I
it?
wanted to see whether you
Yeah.
your interpretation, but I think it's a bit too zoomed out because we had that. There's a couple of things we saw. I think you probably
Yeah, that's it
you
there.
do have
That one
it, yeah.
there, yeah.
And then there's you've got it as well. There's a little sort of rectangular enclosure just to the south of that.
Yeah.
A little kind of house.
And then there's these boundaries that go around there.
Yeah.
So that's in sort of, for those of you who know the woods, it's in like the north side of Bottom Wood, sort of below Holly Copse, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Really. This is that hollow way
Yeah.
that goes down to Five Ways.
It's the
So it's
boundary.
somewhere on the slope there.
Yeah.
But it's sort of quite a significant size, isn't it?
It is big. Yeah, it's big.
Is it like how deep is the ditch?
It's not.
It's not
it's
really
one of the-
ditched, it's just a kind of a very, very level square platform which falls away sharply to the south to its
Great.
sides. And, but currently covered in a lot of felled trees, so it's not easy to
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it, that looked very substantial. But as with all LiDARs, when seeing that, and then getting on the ground in the woodland, you can't see these things.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
experience of using it, it's just, I've dug holes in things, you'll see an enclosure like that on the LiDAR, and you go and try and find it in the woods to dig it, and you're like, I cannot see it, because the distinction can be so good.
There's one very similar, it looks like that in the LiDAR in Greenfield Wood up by Christmas Common. We went in to have a look at that and you try to find it under the tree cover, and when you finally do find it, we went back to historic records and it was a sort of like a woodcutter's enclosure around where he was keeping felled logs back in like 19th century. But I mean, the problem with these things is you just simply can't date them.
No, unless you dig
So you
it.
put a hole in it.
Even then, you don't date them.
Yeah, you don't find anything.
Is the black dot the bear pit?
Sorry?
Is the black dot the bear pit?
Yes.
Yes.
Second one.
Yeah. These two, again,
That
local
one,
knowledge.
yeah.
That's the bear pit.
That's the bear pit, yeah. And some work has been done. I don't know if you've been past the bear pit recently. There are some signs saying archaeological dig going on because there was an amateur archaeologist has been having a go at. Is it you?
Not
No.
me, no.
No, suddenly thought you'd been at Breakfast.
I'm just my children playing
Okay,
it for the
yeah.
last 30
So
odd
there's
years.
been a bit of an effort to. I mean, the thing is that the bear pit. Well, those who've been involved can tell you more. But the bear pit's obviously got multiple stages to its history, and
Yeah.
more recently it was made into a folly. So those little enclosures, the gateway, and then the flint work all around the edges, all kind of Victorian.
Is it a Victorian bear pit then?
Well, no one knows. That's what they're trying to establish. Probably not.
Well,
but anyway,
your
so
grandmother always maintained it was called the Sounding House,
which is an
and
old
it was
map.
built for a religious sect.
Yeah,
No, I
it's
don't
called
know
the
how
Sounding
true
House.
it is.
It could be a chalk pit. It's called, it's got other names on maps. What other names has it got? The Bear Pit, the Sounding House, at least one more.
People know the Ice House.
The Ice House, that's right.
It's got architecturally, it looks like an ice house. It's the same sort of period, but it doesn't make much sense.
It's absolutely nowhere near the major house.
Around the ice
Up the hill. And the other thing is, Romilly, I wonder if you wanted to say anything, because when we had that SOA presentation, you were talking about some of your research into ancient ways.
I get really excited about it all, but I can it all. So it's about, I have sheep and I use the old drove roads, and so I was looking at the LiDAR to see whether I could link some of them up, because obviously there are some that are very, very clear as you go through the woods and are absolutely beautiful, and you can kind of see where, in fact we walked one yesterday. And but it's difficult from the LiDAR to actually stitch them all together. I find that field margins tend to, like, it seems as though they move quite a bit, you know, and yeah, it's difficult to make sense of it all, but
I'd very much like to talk to you. I'll give you a card because we're starting to look at routeways through the Chilterns as part of a little project. It would be great to have your input on that.
yeah, I mean there's a lot of stuff. I mean, in the fields that I graze sheep in, I'm actually a botanist by training, but did an archaeology MA at Reading University, so combined interests. But the botany tells you a lot in those fields, so I knew that there was a lot of archaeology underneath just because of the way it was. And it is interesting because I don't think those have been ploughed very much in modern times, because the LiDAR shows the old field patterns so clearly.
These the ones up here, I think.
Yeah. Yes, yeah,
There's quite a lot.
End, yeah. I think it was common land for a long time, so I think it avoided a lot of serious agriculture.
Certainly there are with like ridge and furrows in the field behind Cherry Tree Cottage up towards Lee Cottage, which would be fun to see on that.
Yeah.
You can zoom in obviously a lot more than that, can't you? Yeah, so you can zoom in and you can see the detail. I'm aware it's quite late, so anyone else? Yeah.
Just one more question about pits in woods. So if they're small, are they saw pits? But if they're big, they're what? Bomb craters or?
Bear pits. Bear pits. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not 100% sure for Oxfordshire. Bucks has a really good online mapping of the known bomb craters, and there are fewer than you would expect. There's a lot, but fewer than you'd expect. Most of the big ones, big round irregular gouges, are going to be chalk extraction pits, or flint extraction pits, or brick earth extraction pits. The regular ones, a saw pit, is going to be much more regular and, you know, about this wide and about the length of this room, and they are exceptionally regular, and they show up quite nicely in the LiDAR as well. So it's that regularity, because you think functionally, you know, those big scooped out ones aren't going to work as saw pits. And then you also can pick up charcoal platforms, which in the LiDAR look pretty much like a saw pit, a little bit shorter, but they're raised instead of being sunk down. So pits you're looking for, if you're looking at visualization, you'll be looking for dark. If you see the light ones, you'll get these lovely charcoal platforms. There's lots of that going on as well.
Are there some natural sinkholes as well?
There are indeed, yes, and one of the best examples showing up on the LiDAR is a little patch of woodland by Fingest, and absolutely wonderful swallowholes that have come through the chalk. Yeah, but the irregular shaped ones tend to be extraction pits. Well, and this is again the use of having the underlying historic mapping too, because you can, you know, if you look at all these and then click on the layer that's the historic mapping, a lot of those chalk extraction pits are labelled.
Can on this portal, is it possible to play with the contrast?
Yeah, you can't play with the contrast. You can play with the transparencies of it. So you can overlay it with other maps and play with the transparencies. But you could ask for a chunk of the LiDAR you're interested in. I can send you the raw data and an online tutorial, a video tutorial that my colleague recorded on how to process it. So. All the software is open source, and you don't need to.
Sorry, very nice one. Do you think in the past then that this area would have been more highly populated than it is now?
Without knowing what your population density is now, I couldn't possibly say.
100 people on the estate.
But yeah, I probably think that's probably this sort of area. I would have thought probably about that. I don't know. But again, how long's a piece of string? I have no idea. And are you including children? People never do in prehistory. They never think about them at all.
It's just, I'm still curious about what doesn't show and what does show. At the western end of the park, which Miriam, the large floodplain meadow,
Yeah.
there is very visible on the ground broad ridge and furrow.
You can see it if you're up this
Can you
close.
see it?
It is very clear there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You were pointing in the wrong place.
That's
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
that's the west end of the park. Yeah, there you can
Yeah,
see
you
it.
can
Yeah,
see
you can see it,
Okay.
and you can see something raised. That's that heap, isn't there? As you come in the gate, you can see that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Not a Bronze Age barrow.
not a Bronze Age barrow, no. Yeah, you can see all those, and there's some very prominent ridge and furrows in. No, that's Apennine. Sorry, excuse me. So maybe we can leave it up and then for a bit and so people can come closer and have a look. That'd be okay, or do you have to rush off?
Oh, no, it's an hour and a half to get home, but
Oh, is it? Okay, well, no pressure. Okay, so unless there's any other pressing questions, maybe we can wrap it up and just say a really big thank you to Wendy. It's so kind of her to drive an hour and a half, she just told me, to come and give this talk to us. So, yeah, big thank you. And the other thing to say is just if you haven't popped a donation in the park, we just take donations so we can give some money towards Tolly for the venue and